All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gotham Writers Inside Writing. Today, we're going to be talking about children's fantasy. But first, some announcements. As you may have heard, the Gotham Writers Conference is going to be on Zoom this year from October 16th through 18th. Registration is open on the Gotham website, and I'll have more details on that at the end of the show. Also, of course, there's the Twitter pitch party at the end of the show as well. I'll be sharing the details for that then also. On to the business of the day. Remember that at any point in the show, you can submit questions for our Q&A portion. There's a button on the Zoom dashboard that says Q&A. You just click that, type in your question, and we'll get to as many as we can before the show is over. So enough of all that. Let's talk about writing children's fantasy. And as always, we're going to start with a quote, this one from Ursula Le Guin, who wrote, "Fantasy is true, of course. It isn't factual, but it is true. Children know perfectly well that unicorns aren't real, but they also know that books about unicorns, if they are good books, are true books." More on that later. Let's meet our guests. First off, the author of the Tower of Wind series and A Deathstruck Year, Makiia Lucier. Hello, Makiia.
Hello.
And our second guest, literary agent at New Leaf, Suzie Townsend. Hello, Suzie.
Hi everyone.
All right, so normally we start with a definition of the genre, but it's pretty self-explanatory, children's fantasy. So I do want to start with one point of clarification. So Suzie, if you don't mind, what's the difference between low fantasy and high fantasy?
I mean, I guess traditionally the difference would be that something that's more lower fantasy or contemporary fantasy would be something that's grounded in the real world but has fantastical elements, whereas something that's high fantasy is fantasy that is a whole other world that has been created by the author that involves, world building. And if you want to separate it out even more, sometimes people will say epic fantasy, which usually sort of like indicates that the world and the fantasy elements and world building that have been creative are just kind of like next level. There's not necessarily like a real clear line in terms of a definition there. It's just, kind of like how big is your world building?
Mm-hmm. And Makiia, where do you classify yourself in that spectrum of fantasy?
My books are a little bit weird in that the world is from scratch. I've built it from scratch. The people, the characters, the technology on map making are all based on real people and worlds from the 14th century Mediterranean. So I have some elements that are historical, some elements like sea monsters that are fantastical. So it's really a mix of both history and fantasy.
Interesting. You touched on a lot of stuff that I want to get back to here in a bit, but I want to start right where you led us into, which is talking about world building. How much time do you, Makiia, how much time do you spend constructing your fantasy realm, particularly with the Tower of Wind series?
So I am, in a former life, I was a librarian. So I think more than writing, I like researching. And with Isle of Blood and Stone, it's a book about map makers set on an island. And when I started it, I didn't know anything except I wanted a map maker on an island. And so I started with the island. And if you go right here, it says that this is the island of St. John del Mar. It's a fake island. But if you were to Google the island of Guam, that's my island. I just used the exact same shape. And I built the world just step by step, draft by draft, creating castles and sea monsters and streets and everything. It's a slow process. And a lot of the research just was researching the Middle Ages, in the Mediterranean, map making, painters, just food, everything. And then slowly just building that world. It's painstaking.
No, that's fascinating. And again, there's so much stuff there I want to get back to, but I want to jump over to Suzie. Suzie, how complex can world building get for younger audiences? Is there a certain point where it becomes too complicated for a young audience to grasp?
So yes and no. I mean, I think that the world can actually be super complicated. It's just that the writer needs to know all of those details and maybe have done all that research or have drawn their own map and sort of figured out everything. But in terms of the details that you're giving younger audiences, I think that, sometimes obviously those details have to be given with the audience in mind as like a lens. So, it's why you might get, a lot of details about the socioeconomic and like political background in a fantasy world in something like Game of Thrones, and you get less of it in Harry Potter. I mean, it's still there. And clearly, and I think that's why I'm saying like, that it might be very complex and the author will know it. But the details that they're giving the characters and that they're giving the readers are just going to be, a little more few and far between. It's just so that you're speaking to the audience's reading level. Mm-hmm. I think it's why Harry Potter, like, a lot of the world building gets a lot more complex as you continue to go through the series. And I think that that's very true for a lot of children's series, is that book one, you're introduced to world elements that are really necessary to understand what the characters are going through and to understand the plot. And then, you can build on that because the reader already knows the characters and they're already familiar with the world. You can introduce new elements in future books.
Mm-hmm. And Makiia, to follow up on that, writing towards a younger audience, do you find yourself ever holding back on details or giving just what's needed, or how do you approach that?
Usually when I start writing, this is every day when I look down at the blank notebook, I don't know what I'm doing. So I just start writing. So I just put in enough details to tell the story. I try not to put more. I try not to put less. But this book is about a royal map maker. So I wanted personally to know what it meant to be a royal map maker. How do you make a map from scratch in the 1400s? So that's the kind of research that went in. And I'm not going to dump every single little detail into that chapter, but I'm going to put enough so that the readers believe that I know what I'm talking about. Hopefully.
Gotcha. Suzie, this might be a tougher question, but what separates the great fantasy realms from the ones that you end up passing on? What can writers do to set their realm apart from someone else's?
So, I mean, I think that there's probably like enough details to make the world feel distinct, and to feel like it's not something that's just been done before. I think that probably my most common complaint about world building is like reading a fantasy manuscript and thinking like, okay, like you're telling me that this is a rule in this world, but there's no real evidence of that. Back when dystopian was a really big sort of genre that a lot of people were writing, or like dystopian fantasy, you would hear the characters say like how hard their life was and how like everything was so terrible. And if the descriptions and the details of the world didn't match that, then it was hard to believe. Like, it was kind of like, okay, you're telling me things are bad, but like, where's the evidence? Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's something that you kind of want to consider, is that you want the world to match whatever your character is saying.
Mm-hmm. So you brought up an interesting point, and I want to turn this over to Makiia, the rules of the world. So when you were constructing this fantasy realm, how much attention did you pay to the rules? Like, you incorporated a lot of history as well as fantasy mythology. So did you still adhere to these historical rules or sort of create your own?
For the most part, I stuck to the historical rules. You have people dressing like they would dress in the 14th century. You have technology, as in the ships, shipbuilding, how fast people can travel, horseback. That is all. I had to stick to the rules. How to make a map. You have to stick to the rules. I followed history. I bought a book by a 14th century artist, talks about how to mix paints, how to build your brushes from scratch, things like that. So those were the rules I stuck with. Where I just kind of went all crazy was with the fantastical elements. I stuck whatever I wanted in those waters. I stuck all kinds of sea monsters. I made up this fin lion, which was so cool. I mean, that's when I did my own thing. But where history was involved, I stuck with rules.
Mm-hmm. I want to get back more to the history later, but I'm curious, Makiia, to follow up on that. How deep were you into the children's fantasy genre? Were you an avid reader of this genre before you started writing in it?
I am just an avid reader. I will read everything and everything. I mean, I remember back when I was a kid, I read everything. I read from Anne of Green Gables, so historical fiction. That was my favorite. But I also read my dad's Louis L'Amour westerns that were inappropriate, that were just hanging around the house. I read my aunt's, raunchy European romances, just all kinds of things. I read everything. So I was just not necessarily into children's literature. I was into literature. I just liked to read.
So what was it that drove you into writing for a young audience? Did it just kind of, that's where your voice fit?
That's where my voice fit. And I think I love that time period. I love where I haven't been a young adult for ages, but I remember that time period is what really formed me, is what I remember most. It was me leaving home and moving to Oregon and moving to Italy as a young adult. And it's just what shaped my life, what still has shaped my life.
Mm-hmm. So I want to share screen now. And Makiia, you already showed this for a second, but I want to show the viewers the map, because we haven't had one of these on the show yet, the map that's associated with her book series. So that's your map. So Suzie, I want to start with you. Do you have to have a map for a fantasy book for kids, or is it just nice to have just in case?
So no, you definitely don't have to have a map. And in fact, it is actually usually the publisher's decision whether they're going to commission a map. Because usually what happens is the publisher says, like, okay, we're going to do a map. We want to commission it. What does your map look like? And then the author will often have like a sketch or a picture or something to point to. And an artist will be hired by the publisher, and they will sort of draw the map, and then the author will have a chance to make any corrections or have any notes or anything like that. There are times, or there is the potential, if the publisher was like, we don't have a budget for a map, that an author could hire an artist to do the map themselves. Or they could, if they were an artist, they could draw the map themselves. But there's definitely books out there that don't have maps. So it's usually from the agent perspective, whenever the publisher is like, we're going to do a map, I'm like, yes, great. Because the maps are great.
And Makiia, you told us where this map came from, where the origin is. And did you create this map? Was this something that you drew yourself, or the idea of it?
The idea of it, I did start that. My daughter actually did the first sketch. She was maybe 8, 9, 10. She was a little kid when she drew the sketch of that map. And because Elias, the main character, is traveling all over that island, I had to plot out where he was going, how long it took him to get there. So that map was very helpful in the beginning. But yeah, and if you look at the map, though, closely, there are some villages. There's, in the north, there's the village of Esperanca. That's my grandmother's name. There's the Sea of Magdalene. Maggie was my mother's name. There's Marinus Road. Back home on Guam, that's called Marine Drive for the Marines who live there. So because it was my map, I was able to put in the details that, that I loved, really.
Mm-hmm. And when you queried this project, was the map part of that, or did it come after?
It came after. Okay. But you know what, Josh? This is a book about map makers.
Mm-hmm.
We really needed a map.
Suzie, is it often that you'll get a map with the query, and how much time do you spend with that? Like, is that something you pay attention to?
Not usually. So most people don't send maps with their manuscript. And there have been a few times when people have sent a map or something like that, but it's usually I need to be able to read the manuscript, and the manuscript alone needs to be able to tell me the details about the world, or instead of tell me, I should say show me the details about the world. Because ultimately, again, when we submit to publishers, I could include something like a map, but they're also going to really want the manuscript to stand on its own rather than having to refer back to the map. And I will say that is something that I think you want to be careful of as a writer, particularly if you're a new fantasy writer, in the sense that you want to make sure that the manuscript stands on its own, that the map isn't doing some of the world building for you. Like, it's you want it to be an extra and a really cool thing, but you don't want it to be a crutch for your readers.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to stop share with that and get back. So we're still talking about world building. Makiia, how much of your own fantasy realm, how much of this world did you know before you started plotting the story for? Like, did you create the world and then start the story, or sort of build the world to fit the story?
So my first drafts, Isle of Blood and Stone in particular, went through 9 drafts from beginning to end. And when I started this book, I pretty much knew nothing except I wanted it on an island. I wanted a map maker, and that's all I had. And so the way I learned what the story was about was by writing the story. There's no easy way out of this. You just have to start writing. And that's where I learned about the characters, about map making, about the world step by step, block by block. It's just draft by draft. It got a little fatter. And, the world got better.
So you wrote the story and then the world kind of filled in around it.
Absolutely, yeah. And there are some things where I wrote the first draft and then I wrote the 8th draft, and there are just things I hadn't even thought of. I mean, it needed to be the total of 9 drafts for this particular story.
Mm-hmm. And Suzie, when you're evaluating a manuscript, we talked about how not to overload world building, but how much of the world do you have to understand in order to get into a story or consider representing it? Do you need to just go ahead?
I mean, I think the key word there is probably understand, in the sense of you want in the beginning, you want your reader, whether it's an agent or a consumer, to feel grounded in the world. And, the best way to do that is to sort of open up the world slowly. Because you never want them to feel like, I don't understand what's happening. You want them to feel like they understand enough to know what's happening. So it's a delicate balance. You're trying to sort of string people along. I've heard the analogy used of your world building is a little bit like leaving breadcrumbs. Like, you're giving little details as the reader goes along so that they continue to understand the story and the plot and what the characters are going through.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk more about the history now behind this. And Makiia, you told us where the history came from. What was it about this historical period that you felt was a great place to set this fantasy story?
So the hardest part for me is to find an idea that will sustain me throughout an entire story. So the book has to be full of things that fascinate me. With Isle of Blood and Stone, it's just a giant collection of random things that fascinate me, that I kind of just cobbled together into a story. There's, I love the Middle Ages. I'm a giant germaphobe, but I love reading about germs, and I love reading about medieval medicine, and I love just because it's gross and so just unhygienic. So I threw that in there. Just old maps have always fascinated me. I love the pretty ones, not those ugly blue maps you see in your social studies class. I didn't like those maps. I like the ones with the sea monsters in them, or the old ships. And so I threw that into my book. So it was a compilation of all the things, historical things that interested me, really.
And Suzie, do you find that fantasies are better off if they're grounded in history, or can it just be a fantasy realm that comes out of essentially from nowhere?
I mean, I think it can definitely be, you can have a fantasy realm that comes out of nowhere. I think if you're inspired by a historical time period or a place or certain things, and it doesn't have to all be the same, like it could be a mishmash of things, but I think pulling from inspiration ultimately is a little bit easier. I mean, obviously it requires a lot more research and things like that, and to blend it together, but you have a starting point. Whereas if you're coming up from something totally from scratch, what can happen a lot is because you don't have historical sort of rules and guidelines to fall back on, the world can sometimes feel a little bit amorphous or confusing. As a reader, usually because I'm not in the author's head, sometimes my questions are kind of like, well, I don't understand why this is happening. Like, why are people still wearing corsets, but also, you know, talking on phones? Like, why? And sometimes the writer doesn't necessarily have a good answer for that. And so using a historical time period or using something as inspiration to build from, I definitely think is more common.
So Makiia, you also wrote A Deathstruck Year, which is YA historical fiction. I'm curious what made you, yes, there, right there. I'm curious what made you want to put that one in the real world, while Isle of Blood and Stone comes from a fantasy realm that's based in history. So what made you put one in historical, one in fantasy?
Well, A Deathstruck Year was my first book. It was my debut book. And I was fascinated at the time by the 1918 Spanish flu. And I knew I wanted to write about Portland, Oregon. I spent 11 years living in Oregon, so I picked a city there that I knew, I was familiar with, that I loved. And I wanted a young adult novel about a girl volunteering for the American Red Cross during the Spanish flu. So this book was really different in that it really stuck to the rules. I went through, with each chapter, it was like writing a thesis. I knew all the facts behind every single thing I wrote because I knew my editor, my agent, my copy editor would say, hey, is this right? Hey. So everything was, I had footnotes, endnotes, notes. And the difference was, with my second book, I just wanted a little more freedom to go just go a little crazy. So I started writing, fantasy.
Got it. And Suzie, I'm curious, are younger audiences more attracted to fantasy than historical?
I mean, traditionally, yes. I think it's a little eerie right now how relevant A Deathstruck Year is today. But a lot of times kids, they're so centered in what's going on in their own lives that things that are historical can feel so far away. And so you really have to, for a historical book to work and to be successful, you really have to figure out a way to make a historical time period relatable, which sometimes is hard. Whereas fantasy, you're actually oftentimes getting sort of cool historical elements, but you're also getting, magic and high stakes and different things like that. And I think that tends to draw, young readers in a little bit more. It makes a story more exciting than for them to just think about, what was in history.
Mm-hmm. Makiia, you brought up a point last time that I want to get back to, where you said you had so much research going into each chapter. How do you strike that balance between telling a story and working in these historical details?
If I could get away with it, I would put in everything. It would just be a giant, fat book. But I have editors, and I have Suzie, who will tell me, usually, they are really, really honest about, or this is too much, this is not working, this is just overkill. So you learn because you have people, you have your agent, your editor, you have people who want your book to succeed, who will be honest about whether or not your book is working or not, whether you need to cut, or whether you need to add, or whether you need to tweak. You have people who help you, because it can't just be you deciding that your book is fantastic, because it's usually not. You need help.
Got it. So let's transition into talking about character building. Makiia, your main character, Elias, in one of my favorite reviews of the book, they called him a less stupid Jack Sparrow, which I think that's just great. I'm curious, where did this character come from? Where did you create him from?
So one of my favorite series of movies growing up were the Indiana Jones movies. I loved the idea of this character who was not only handsome, but he was smart. I mean, he's a character who used his brains to solve the puzzles and to stay alive throughout his story. So Elias is based in part on Harrison Ford, when he was young. I just wanted someone who was smart. I have a kid, I don't want to write dumb characters. I wanted a book and a character and a story that I could be proud of, that my kid could be proud of, really.
And Suzie, what do young audiences look for in a protagonist, or what do you look for also in a protagonist when you're evaluating a story?
So, I mean, I often say things like, I'll follow a character that I love anywhere. And a character that I love is typically someone who, they're not perfect. They sometimes make mistakes, but I always understand what's motivating them and why they're making the choices they do. And I think that's kind of how you can build someone who feels really real. I think it's important that they're not perfect. It's important that even if they're not super likable, or like maybe if they're an anti-hero or whatever, that they still are sympathetic in some way, that you understand what they've been through to sort of make them want what they want. And then really kind of, making sure that their thoughts and feelings are on the page as much as possible. I think that really helps people understand who the character is and what they want.
Mm-hmm. And Makiia, how well did you know Elias before you began writing his story? Did you just I see you shaking your head already, so take it away.
No, I shouldn't know anything about him at all. I just knew he was. So the premise of the story is it's about a young map maker, 19-year-old Elias, who discovers a riddle hidden in the borders of an old map. And what the map suggests is that 18 years ago, two boy princes who were supposedly murdered might still be alive. So this story is about Elias trying to solve a riddle and trying to stay alive in the process. And that's pretty much all I knew. I didn't know anything about his family. I didn't know anything about his quirks. I didn't know who he loved, who he hated, why he hated them. It was a learning process with every draft. So we got to know each other, Elias and I.
I love that. I hear so many writers who do like a character questionnaire before they start their story, so they know everything about them before they go in. So you were just getting to know him as well. But I'm curious then, with the editing process, did you ever discover stuff about him later on in the draft that you then had to go back and incorporate it earlier?
Oh yeah, it's such a pain. It's pain because there's no way out of it. It's just I'm slow and I don't figure things out until maybe draft 6. But you have to go back and you have to go fix things, and it's just so slow, and it's a back and forth and a back and forth, and that's just how it's always been. I don't know what I don't know until I know it. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, it absolutely does. So I want to shift gears a little bit. I want the quote that I use at the top of the show from Ursula Le Guin. It's interesting because she says that fantasy is true, even though we know that what's in it isn't. So, Suzie, let's get philosophical for a second. What do you think that means? It's that fantasy is true.
I mean, I think that on one hand, like, everything in fantasy novels, there's always some kind of kernel of truth in them. There's some, the themes are things that people can relate to no matter where they live or, what time period they're in. And so I think that that's definitely true. I also think that, as a reader and as someone who really loves fantasy, that, you can read books and like, sure, it might be made up and it came from an author's imagination, but those worlds can feel so real and those characters can feel so real, and they can, they can inspire the readers in a way that it feels like it exists.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Makiia, do you have anything to add to that about what makes fantasy true?
It's because fantasy has characters and has people with feelings, and you can relate to it because we talk about friendships. We talk about falling in love for the first time. We talk about hating people. So these are all things you can relate to, even in a fantastical world. They are human emotions. Even if the characters aren't human, you recognize them.
So that leads into my next question, which is about sort of the theme that comes up in fantasy. Makiia, when you set out to write these books, it sounded like you just wanted to tell a really good story. Did you have like a bigger point that you wanted to make with these stories, or just telling a story?
No, I really, usually I just don't know what I'm doing. I just try and tell a good story. And things like theme and what the bigger picture is not something I really consider until the very end because I don't see it until the very end.
So at what point in the process in the Isle of Blood and Stone did you discover a theme, or were you writing and you were just like, oh, here it is?
Here it is. And then you read reviews and they tell you what your theme is. I mean, it's not something I really think about, really.
That's great. Suzie, do kids' books have to have a theme? I mean, for kids, you feel like you always want to say something to them, but are adventure stories just fine on their own?
I mean, I think that, so what it is like, you know, oftentimes, and I hear this from a lot of writers, is like Makiia said, they're focusing on the story, and they're writing a story and writing a character and that character's journey. And I think that theme oftentimes comes from the arc of the character in a way, in that, you know, you can look at the character and who they were at the beginning of the story and who they are at the end when they come out the other side. And usually there is some kind of theme that you can pull from that. I think that theme is usually something that is more for like a reader to kind of decide. I've certainly written editorial letters where I've said, like, this feels like the theme. Can we pull this out a little bit more? Can we add something to this? And I've seen editors say similar things in editorial letters as well, of kind of like, you know, fleshing something out that's really already there. But I think that, you know, it is, when you write a good story with great characters that change and develop like over the course of an adventure, that readers they'll find a theme in there. But it is something that's probably, I think, and it probably works better when it's a little bit more subconscious on the writer's part versus, you know, them kind of going into the process thinking like, here's my theme. Sometimes I certainly have read books where the theme feels a bit heavy-handed. And I think that sometimes comes from the writer being like, but this is the lesson that I want to instill. And I just don't think you probably need to focus on that very much.
Mm-hmm. So, Makiia, one thing I always find so fun about science fiction and fantasy, you can essentially do whatever you want. You can go wherever you want, create whatever you want. Does that ever feel overwhelming to you, just sort of existing in this world that doesn't exist, that you're creating?
No, because you still have rules. You still have to stick to the rules of your world. So my first book for Isle, it was set on an island. So it wasn't overwhelming because I was on my island, and so you couldn't really go all over the place. For the companion novel, Raina, the main character, leaves the island of St. John Demo. She goes a little out there. So it expanded the world, but there were still limitations to where she could go. So the limits are very helpful. They keep you from just going nuts and just, you know, losing your place in your story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I feel like, you know, Makiia has talked about kind of like basically like the physical sort of like world limitations of kind of like, well, they're on an island, and if they're taking a ship, they can only go so fast and so far at one time. And things like that. And that's definitely something to think about. I think one of the things I see a lot too is if you're introducing some kind of magic into your world, then you need to have sort of rules and guidelines, because something that, you know, sometimes we'll see is like a character with like unlimited magic. They're unchecked and they're too powerful, and there's no limitations to what they can do, which means they can solve anything, and then you don't have enough conflict in your story. So that's kind of like ways that your rules for your world building and setting those limitations can ultimately help you. It's because it helps create conflict.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. And I'm curious, with how wide this genre can go, with all the places it can go, Suzie, are there any tropes you're tired of seeing, or stuff that people should steer away from, just overwritten subject matters or stuff like that?
I mean, it usually sort of stems from things that are like really popular in the moment. So, you know, when I first got into the industry, I would have answered that by saying like, no wizard school, please. Just because I'd seen a lot of that. I think right now, you know, there's a lot of fantasy out there, and I think there was a long period of time where like you really saw like mostly like European based fantasy where like characters had their broadswords and ale. And I do think that that's changed a lot. There's a lot more, you know, sort of worlds and cultures that are serving as inspiration for fantasy novels. And I think that's really exciting. I would say that the tropes that sort of get me the most are the ones that are a little bit more character based. You know, the trope of the character who like doesn't realize they have magic and thought they were normal, but then they've turned, you know, they're a teenager now and they suddenly are coming into this power. And that sort of chosen one kind of trope, that's definitely been a little bit overdone. I'm not a fan of the romance trope where you have like a female character who really likes a mysterious guy who like might want to hurt her, but you're not sure. But he's just so attractive that she doesn't care. That one bothers me. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's hard, you know, to sort of do something that feels fresh and unique. And the best way to do it is to really, you know, do a lot of research and really build the world and the characters in a way that they feel, if they feel real, then they'll feel distinct.
I want to answer that. Can I?
Yes.
Okay. So, funny you should ask. I love this book. It's by Diane Wynne Jones, and it's called The Tough Guide to Fantasyland. And what I love about it is that it includes all the common tropes in fantasy literature. There's the Forest of Doom. There's the giants. There's the fact that everyone eats stew, only stew, and nothing else. So I like this maybe once a year because it helps me kind of avoid using the common tropes, but also, sure, you can have your Forest of Doom, but maybe think a little bit harder. How can you make your Forest of Doom different from everyone else's? Or instead of stew, maybe actually do the research. What were people eating in the Mediterranean in the 1400s? Maybe, you know, use that instead of the stew. So it's just, it's a fun read every year just to refresh your memory. But I love it. It's great.
Thank you. Suzie, when it comes to the story components of a really good children's fantasy story, how would you rank the importance of them between voice, character building, world building, plot? What would you say are the three main things that people should be focusing on?
That's tough because, I mean, ultimately it's a crowded marketplace and they all end up sort of being equally important in the end. I think from an agent perspective and knowing that when I see the manuscript that I will probably do a round of edits on it and then it'll go to an editor who hopefully will buy it and then edit it. And it's not necessarily a finished product. The most important things to me in the children's space, like the number one thing is voice. Because that's something like you have it or you don't. It's not something that I can necessarily fix. You know, I can say like the voice doesn't feel right, but I can't necessarily give notes on how to fix it. That the author has to kind of do that themselves. The next big thing for me is characters. The characterization has to be really well done. World building and plot are usually things that like I can fix. Those are things where I can ask world building questions and be like, well, I don't understand this, you know, and having a conversation with the author, then we can figure out like what needs to be written in the manuscript to address this issue. And I can certainly point out plot holes or things that don't make sense. And those are pretty easy to edit as long as there's not too many. But the other thing that probably like I guess my number 3 thing would be the pacing. Because that's something, it's a little bit harder to address. You can point out moments that feel slow or moments that feel, like the story is moving too quickly and it feels rushed. But at the end of the day, it's the author who has to go in there and fix that. It's not something I can solve with like line edits or just, asking a question. And so because those are the harder things for me to address, those are the things that really fall on the author as like really important to try to figure out before you're querying. I mean, you don't want to like, neglect your plot or anything either, but I think that the pacing, the characters, and the voice, those are the things that, most agents are going to be like, that has to be there.
And Makiia, do you find yourself putting higher precedence on like character building, world building, or what is your order of priority when you're writing? Or is it just kind of all meshed together?
It's all meshed together, really. And I just want to point out that with Isle of Blood and Stone, it went through 9 drafts total, but the first drafts were just me and Suzie. Suzie is really hands-on on saying, that doesn't work, fix it. Or asking the hard questions where you're like, ugh! But, it was so helpful. So it took 5
I'm glad I inspire that in you.
So 5 drafts with Suzie before we thought it was ready, to try and sell to a publisher. So it's a lot of work behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm. So I always like to ask what makes a book stand out with these particular stories. So Suzie, what was it about Makiia's books that made you think this is the story that's going to make it?
Oh, the characters for sure. I mean, so when Makiia queried, she queried with A Deathstruck Year, and I remember reading that and I remember at points like just sobbing, just like being like so afraid for the characters. And I'm sure, I don't actually remember how many rounds of revision we did on that. I'm sure we did some. But even in the first draft that I saw, at least, I, was moved enough by the characters that I, cried and was like rooting for them. I was definitely very invested in the potential romance. And so those are the things that I really looked for. And I remember when she first sent me Isle, I was so excited that it was, and back then it was called A Riddle of Princes. And I was so excited because it felt different, like the world building and the island and the fact that this map makers, like that felt really cool and different to me. And so I was definitely like super invested in that. And Elias, I mean, I just rooted for him from the very beginning. I was so excited and I wanted him to solve the riddle. And there's, a familial reason, and there's like a personal investment in the story for him as well, in addition to just like figuring out what happened to these princes. And so that was something that I got really sucked into.
And Makiia, was there anything that you felt set this apart, or was it just, I suspect the answer is just that you just wanted to write it?
Just wanted to write it, yeah. But what I remember is writing the first draft of my first book, so A Deathstruck Year, for Suzie. And I sent out a couple of query letters. And I remember Suzie, though. Suzie sent me, it wasn't an immediate, yay, we're friends. It was, hey, your manuscript is very interesting. It's not 100% yet, but if you are willing to read my notes and revise, I would be more than happy to take another look. So it wasn't right away we were best friends. So I did the work, I resubmitted, and then we were friends. But yeah, it took time.
Gotcha. So I want to ask one last question before we get into our audience questions, and that is recommendations for aspiring children's fantasy authors out there. Suzie, we'll start with you. What are some titles you would recommend them read? And it can be your projects too. That's perfectly fine.
Oh man. I don't know. I mean, I think obviously you should all read Makiia's books because they're great. I thought that Makiia's recommendation about the fantasy trope book was really good. definitely was like, I need to write that down. But I think that there is, you do really want to be widespread in the genre and the age group that you're writing. So, if you're writing fantasy for middle grade, then you should be reading some of the big middle grade fantasies, some of the ones that are successful, that are doing well. Shannon Messenger has a middle grade series that's been long running, and I'm totally forgetting the name of it. But if you look up Shannon, the author, you'll see the books. But they're published by Simon and Schuster, and they've done very well. And they're definitely your sort of, commercial fantasy adventure stories. And so if that's what you're writing, like that, you want to read more of those. If you're writing, sort of like a fantasy, but that feels a bit like fairy tale-esque, that tends to be like my middle grade sweet spot. So my author, Marcy Kate Connolly, her first book was called Monstrous, which feels a bit like a Frankenstein-ish retelling, but that's kind of like an original fairy tale. Or Heather Kastner, whose second novel just came out. It's called The Forest of Stars. And, it's about a girl whose father is missing, and she's going to go look for him. And she finds a sort of a carnival and gets sort of swept up in working for the carnival. And then on the flip side, if you're writing for young adults, you really want to sort of focus on what's doing well in that space. And I think especially in YA, you want to be pretty widely read, because since it is a bit of a trend seeking market where, you get a lot of similar books that come out around the same time, you really want to be able to read those so that you can identify like what worked in certain books and what things, are things that maybe are tropes that you want to avoid as well. So I would definitely recommend Leigh Bardugo's series, Shadow and Bone, and all the books that come after, because they're very good. Victoria Aveyard's Red Queen series has done very well. And Mindy Arnett had 2 books come out in the past couple of years. The first one was called Onyx and Ivory. And that's definitely like, it's a little bit more of like a sort of traditional high fantasy. And yet she managed to take a lot of different tropes and sort of twist them around so that they felt very original.
Thank you. And Makiia, do you have recommendations?
Yeah, she's not technically, Naomi Novik writes the Temeraire series, and those aren't technically YA, but I think they could be. I think they should be. And those books are fantastic because they're about, they're set during England's war against Napoleon, but with dragons, which makes it just awesome. I also love Juliet, is it Marillier? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name.
Yeah.
Her Shadowfell series, it's her YA series, and I thought that was fantastic because the character, her name is Naren, is she's not amazing. She can't fight and speak all kinds of languages and do all kinds of magical things. She's very quiet, but she's the main character and she kicks butt. And I just love those quiet characters that you don't expect to just kick butt. She was one of my favorites. I find myself stuck reading the same authors over and over again because I love their books so much. So it's hard for me to expand. But what I found very helpful is to just Google. You can just go online and look up the best fiction lists by the Young Adult Library Association. And every year they have a new list of fantastic stories, contemporary YA, fantasy YA, all kinds, fairy tale retellings, whatever. And those are the best of the best. And that's the list I look at when I work my way through and try to expand my horizons.
Thank you both. That's a lot of recommendations, so thank you. Got some questions from the audience now. First one, Makiia, is for you. You said your story went through 9 drafts. Did you finish that draft and then go back and edit, or did you like stop and then go back and edit certain chapters along the way?
So I finished my rough draft, which was a pamphlet. It was maybe 45,000 words. And that draft no one saw. That was just me. And then I put it away for a little bit, and I came back and I finished the official first draft. And that's the draft that Suzie saw. And that was still a pamphlet. That was just low 50,000s. So it's just going on and on. I think my final draft was 92,000 words. So there are all these words that I didn't know enough to put in the rough draft.
Gotcha. And Suzie, you mentioned for Makiia's, you responded with a revise and resubmit. This person asked, when do you submit a book? Does it need to be, in need of editing? Should it be edited? Do you prefer it to be 99% done? Where do you like to see a manuscript?
I mean, so I always say that you really want the book to be as perfect as you yourself can make it. I don't think that anyone needs to hire a professional editor or anything like that, but it certainly should be, revised and edited on your own. You never want to submit something where you've, just typed to the end and then you're like, here you go, agent. Because we get so many books. And so, it does really need to be at a place where I can read it and think oh, okay, this is almost there.
Mm-hmm. And Suzie, this question could be for either one of you, but I'll ask Suzie this. For YA fantasy, what's the word count range that you look for?
I think actually what Makiia was just saying is pretty helpful on this, is that, I think that most published YA fantasy falls somewhere in the realm of probably 85,000 to 105,000 words. And the more you edit, typically with an agent or editor, the more you end up adding to that word count. So I think that you want to try to have something that is probably over 60,000 words, and that's definitely under 100,000 words, because you want, basically for submitting to editors, you want it to be sort of as close to that 80 to 100,000 range as possible.
Mm-hmm. So last question from the audience. I do want to direct this to you, Suzie, again. Just because I really want to hear what you have to say. What made Harry Potter such a force of nature? Why haven't other stories been as successful? What did Harry Potter have that nothing else has had?
I think there is an element of Harry Potter being first, in terms of there may have certainly been stories that have come after Harry Potter that had elements. It's just, oftentimes when something is first, that is what people continue to go back to. But I think that there is a lot of sort of universal, truths or universal themes in the Harry Potter books. It's ultimately good versus evil. And that I think I can't remember which book, maybe the 5th book, where, Harry is realizing all of his similarities to Voldemort, and you have, basically you're realizing that the difference between good and evil is actually just the idea that you have love in your life and kindness and things like that. And I think that you have basically such a kind of an archetypal struggle of good versus evil, and yet characters who are able to see good and evil and the shades in between in them. And I think that, that is certainly a testament to the world building and probably the time that she spent drawing the world and the characters. I read somewhere at some point, that she was building the story and thinking about it for years before she actually ever wrote the first novel. And I think that's something that it often can be forgotten or sort of glossed over. But I think that any writer could tell you that, if they've lived with their characters and their world for a really long time, that then when they actually write the story and are editing the story, that it just feels so much more real than, kind of like conceiving of it and sitting down and writing it in, a span of a couple months.
Mm-hmm. So one last question, just if you could give one quick piece of advice to writers who are writing in children's fantasy, what would that piece of advice be? Makiia, we'll start with you.
I think it's just most helpful for me is to read widely, is to read not only the books you love, but read the books that you don't love. Read them and look at them like a textbook. Why don't I love this? Why don't I like these characters, this plot, this setting? And make notes of what you want to avoid in your own stories. I found that very, very helpful.
Suzie, your advice?
Yeah, I mean, so my original advice was going to be very similar to Makiia's, and I was going to say to read widely. And I definitely agree with what she said about, read the books you love, of course, but also read other books. And if you don't love them, think about like, what is it about the book that doesn't make you love them? The other thing, I guess my next piece of advice would just be to keep writing, in the sense that, a lot of times it's not the first book that gets published. It might not even be the first book that gets an agent. I know many writers who wrote several books before they ever queried. And, they might be able to go back to their first book later and to think like, oh, what can I do with this? How can I fix it? And because it's reading a lot and it's writing a lot, that's really going to help you with your craft, because every book you write, you learn new lessons and you figure new things out. So I think that's definitely a sort of second piece of advice, and kind of going into hand in hand with that is not to give up, because this can definitely be a discouraging industry at times. And, a lot of people can say no. But really, all you need is that one yes, that can sort of kick things off.
Well, thank you both so much for being here. You've been wonderful panelists. You've given a lot of great insight and advice. So you both are free to go. And then I'm just going to wrap up the show with a couple of announcements. But thank you again both for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Yep. All right. So for those of you that want to get involved after, let me pull up my share screen here. Two things I want to tell you about. First off, like I said, the Gotham Writers Conference is October 16th through 18th. Registration is open on the website. We have tables filling up. So if you want the chance to sit at a table with two agents in your genre for 4 hours, this is your chance to do that. Well, not at an actual table. It's going to be through a Zoom room. But you can see on the website what agents we have. That's going to expand the more that tables fill up. So get your seat if you see agents you want to hang out with and talk about your project with. Also, as usual, we have our pitch party on Twitter afterwards. So if you have a children's fantasy project of your own, you can go over to Twitter and pitch it. I'll take some of the pitches and send them on to Suzie for her feedback. Just make sure that when you're pitching, you include the hashtag PITGOTHAM. That's Pit Gotham. You don't have to tag anyone. You don't have to tweet at anybody. Just make sure you include that hashtag or I can't find it. You have until Friday at midnight to do that. A couple tips about pitching your book on Twitter. Make sure it's just a single tweet. Multiple tweet pitches are not allowed. If you have more than one book to pitch, you may pitch them all. Just use separate tweets for each. And it's also a good idea to have a good comparable title or two. Other than that, end with a hook. You're not trying to give the whole story away. You're trying to get the agent interested. Tweets are very short, so the shorter you can make it, the better. And again, include the hashtag PITGOTHAM. That's all I have for today. Next week, we're going to be back with historical fiction. And then the week after that, we'll be doing debut fiction. So both of those registrations are up on the website now. You can get your seat and sign up. Until next time, thank you all for being here, and I'll see you next week.